So as a reminder, I think again, most of you I think have been here before, but of course, if you have any questions that you want answered, throw them in the chat, speak up. The goal is to get all of them answered. So uh, please feel free to do that. But as per usual, we'll do two things today. First, we'll do a little bit of a brief discussion on uh, the topics for this week, and then we'll hopefully again spend most of the time on live coding. Thank you to the one person who I don't know who submitted the feedback form last week with a great suggestion. So you will hopefully see that show up this week with some more interactive stuff for the group. So yeah, another reason why you should all fill out the feedback form as well at the end that I'll put up, make these sessions more useful. But with that, let's just jump in to this week. So two big topics, I think for this week that we can talk about. The first is you all have taken a look at all the materials for this week. This concept of React hooks, which is a very important feature of React that we'll talk a little bit about, and you've already seen a little bit. And then we'll also talk about state again, just like we did last week, but go into some more details in depth as well around how it's used in React. So let's first talk about hooks. So hooks are a relatively newer feature in React. Relative, I say relatively. I think they were introduced first in like 2018 or 2019, so still a few years ago. But they, I would say, fundamentally changed how people used React at the time. And effectively, you can think of hooks as some additional functionality that React is giving you that you have access to in an easy way. So there's many built-in hooks that are there in React. I've listed some of them here on the left that you might have seen in the materials as well. We've already seen use state, right? It gives us the ability to think about state for a component and have this value that we can keep updating. The two other ones that you will see, which are very common, are one called useRef and another called useEffect. We'll spend more time this week talking more about useRef. UseEffect we'll spend much more time on useEffect in a later week. But at a high level, useRef, or ref here stands for reference essentially, is a way to keep track of some value. So whether that's a specific like actual like numeric value or component maybe or an element on the screen that you want to maintain a consistent reference to as the component re-renders. Because as we know, right, when, for example, we say, hey, some state variable changes, the whole component gets re-rendered completely. So it throws away the old component, just like re-renders it completely on screen. So for all intents and purposes, the computer thinks it's like a brand new separate thing. And so useRef gives us the ability to keep a strong reference to a specific element, let's say, through all those re-renders. And so it just makes our life easier in many ways. And so the most common, I would say a very common thing that's used for is to keep reference to UI elements that you want to do specific things with. We will see what this looks like in practice very shortly. The other one that comes up is useEffect. It's I would say one of the more trickier concepts in React to get your head around. So I will just say some words today about it. You should ask questions about it as you have them, but also just know like we're going to go much deeper into useEffect in the next couple of weeks. So don't worry too much about it right now, I would say. But at a high level, useEffect allows you to run what are called side effects that, let's say, are not related to the actual like showing of UI on the screen. So for example, this could be things like loading data from somewhere or working with some other like non-React code that like non-React specific code that you want running. Let's say like a mouse, like you have event listers on the screen for like, oh, you're hovering over a specific area of the screen, for example. Like you would run all those in these useEffect constructs essentially and use that to manage them. Again, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, what I just said. That's fine, because we're going to revisit this and see all the glorious applications of useEffect in a couple weeks. So don't worry too much about that. Just know it's a thing that exists, and it's just another one of these hooks that come with React for free. I will say there are other hooks that React gives you. For example, just to put names out there in case you see them. There's a use memo hook, use callback hook. There's a lot of other hooks as well built in. Those are the primary ones. And then you have the ability to make your own custom hooks, which can become really useful in certain situations. But again, we're not going to get into that this week, but just so you know, what's out there with React hooks. Okay, questions about hooks before we refocus ourselves on state and go through that again. All right. So the only other thing I would point us to is just on the right-hand side of this slide. I just pulled together or clustered together a very simple example that takes advantage of state and ref. So hopefully the state stuff starts to look a little bit more familiar to you all as you start working with state. But I'll point you just to how ref is used in this case. So you can see if you just stare at the bottom here where all the HTML is being rendered out, you can see there's an input element here, an input box that we're typing a username into in this case. And what we've done here is we've said, well, eventually when this form submits, we want to know what's actually been typed into that input box. So we're going to use a ref here to get a reference to the input. So you can see at the top, we create this ref using the use ref hook here. This const username input equals use ref. And then in the actual element, we've tagged this element to the ref by passing it in as a prop, essentially. And so that's what ties this element to then this ref we have up here. And so now in this handle submit function, we can say username input dot current, which is how you work with refs and getting like the current value attached to the ref. And then we can go with dot value and then do whatever we want then with the value in the input field. So yeah, just to get you an example of how this is used in practice. Again, it's not the only way that refs are used, but it's one of the more common use cases for it. All right. Any questions on any of that before we jump into revisiting state again?
Um, Hi.
Go for it. What's up?
Yeah, I think I'm not getting clearly what you just explained with regards to use ref. If you could touch on it again.
Yes. Okay. Let me try again, and let's see if I can get a annotation tool up here so I can actually circle things. I think this should work. Okay. So let's try this again. So for the ref, I would focus on two parts of this code. The first is up here where we say const username input equals use ref. So this is actually setting up the ref using the hook. And the second thing I would focus on is this input element down here. Uh, yes, I can't draw ovals properly with this trackpad. But this input element down here, and you can see what we've done is we've attached the ref as a prop here. So we said ref equals the username input, which is what we set up with the use ref. So this is now, this username input variable has a strong reference to this input element on the screen. So now in this handle submit function, which, this is a form. So at some point we're going to submit the form with this username or something. And you can see in this line here that I'm drawing an arrow to, we can now go and access the value in that input. We can say const username equals username input, which is the ref, dot current. That's just syntax for how you get the current value attached to the ref.
Okay.
And then dot value, then that just becomes regular syntax for accessing the value of an input element.
Yeah.
And then do whatever we want from there. So that's how we're getting access to the input element and the value in it.
Would this be like similar to I don't know, putting an ID on an HTML element?
Yeah, you can think of it like that. It has in this specific case, it serves a very similar function. As I said, use ref is it's a pretty generic tool, so it can be used for other things. But yeah, again, one of the more common use cases for it is sort of attaching itself to UI elements and doing things like, what you could do with a get document by ID essentially, right? And in a kind of normal HTML JavaScript setting.
Okay.
And again, I think the reason, just to hammer this point, Hope, the reason why that doesn't really work here is because like although this HTML here at the bottom seems very static, right? You're like, oh, there's a span and there's a form and the label, like nothing here is going to change. In reality, in the background, React could be re-rendering this component like hundreds of times for some reason, right? Just because that's how React works. And so every time it re-renders this component, it literally throws away the current component and creates it from scratch again, from like new. And so it's like you have 100 copies of this component that's being cycling through every second, millisecond, whatever. So in reality, like by default, you're never going to have a strong reference, let's say, to this input element because there might be 100 copies of it being rendered. And so this is how we keep that strong reference to like this input element across all those renders. So that's why we need it in React. Any other questions on ref, use ref, hooks in general, or we move on to talking more about state from last week?
So real quick, use effect, you're saying it's used more for non-UI like data handling?
Yeah, in general, I would sort of. I think it could have reference to it could be related to UI. Just to give you like an example, right? Which I briefly mentioned earlier. Like let's say for example, you have let's say you have a need to keep track of a mouse event over a button. Let's say like you want to know like, hey, when's the mouse over a button versus not? So how you would typically do that maybe in JavaScript is you would attach a mouse event listener, and then you would essentially have that listener, which is just a regular like browser API, to then track whether the mouse is over the button. So to set all that up, you would end up running that all in use effect because that's not related to the actual rendering of the UI, but it is related to like some background process essentially that you want to run, right? That might have an input on the UI. So that's like one example, right? Which is like very much related to the UI stuff. And then there's the very non-UI related stuff, which is like I'm just trying to load data from an API somewhere, for example, like you throw that into a use effect. So it's very flexible. There's a lot of things that can happen in the use effect. It's a very general purpose tool.
Thanks.
Mhm. And as I said, if if that seems confusing to you all at this point, that's fine because it use effect is one of the things that trips people up most when you're getting started React. And as I said, we're gonna I spend a whole week on it in a couple weeks, so you'll get lots of more practice with it and more detailed instruction on it. Any other final questions before we revisit state? All right, then let's keep rolling. Okay, so I know we talked about state a little bit last week. I know you all probably still getting used to state in some way. So let's just go through an exercise, and I want you all to kind of drive this portion here. So I've set up a very simple component, as you can see, and it's really simple. The goal of this component is essentially to click a button and have it generate like a random number, and it just shows that number on the screen. So you can see here, right now there's just a span set up, just this generate number, and I just put number one, and there's a button that you can click, but that's it. So question is, how would we go about using state to actually make this random number generator actually function and work? Anyone want to take a first try at how we might do this? Feel free to just come off mute and just start talking.
Well, first, um, import useState, create a variable using destructuring, uh, and I guess the variable would be maybe like number instead of like one.
Yep,
And
that's a
then
good start. And I think for that also in the chat pretty much said the same thing. So that's a good starting point, setting up the state.
add an event listener to the button that will create a function and then use that as the event listener and button and then call set number um, in that function
Nice.
for
Okay.
whenever the button's clicked.
Okay. And then maybe there's one final step we might need to take. Yep, Brittany, that's a good point as well. We can handle non-number input. That's a fair, yep, that would be a fair point. I think in this case, luckily, I think we don't have to worry about that since we're just gonna click a button. But that's a good call. We should keep that in mind. The one final thing that I don't think anyone has mentioned yet, which is probably maybe a bit obvious, but
In the set set function or whatever, we need to have a number generator.
yep, that's right. So we need to generate new numbers and using the set function from the state. And then there's one other thing. Let's say we need one other thing to make sure that we can actually see the number.
We need to render it.
Yes. And where would you render it in this case?
Before the return.
Do we want to try that one more time?
Would it be in place of the number one?
Yep,
Like
that's
curly
right. We can just
braces and
swap out.
then variable.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So I think you all got it. So let's look at I think this is pretty close essentially to what you all put together as a group. Um, but yeah. So as you all were saying, and let's use this annotate tool. I think this is helpful. Um, so yeah, first thing we want to do is set up this state that we want. We can call it number. I just call it current number in this case. And then we have the we destructure the use state. The one thing which I guess maybe we didn't explicitly talk about is remember in use state you can pass in what we want the initial value to be. So in this case, we can just say make it a random number directly as the initial value. Remember, you don't have to set an initial value. You can just not pass anything in, and then the initial value will be essentially undefined. Um, so it depends on the use case, but in this case, we can set to some random number. And then, as we said, most importantly, we need to actually make sure we render this here, as we were just saying at the end there, just adding this current number in curly braces because it's JavaScript and just rendering it directly in the span. And then to actually make the button work, yep, set up the on click. And in this case, we just pass the function and a button press, and then we can just essentially set the state to a new random number. So nice job. Any questions on any of those components? Ideally, we would like to make sure everyone on this call is feeling at least somewhat comfortable with what we just went through, because this is a pretty good example of sort of how you work with state. All right. So I'm going to take that as you all are experts on state, which is great. Obviously, any questions come up later on, please feel free to just bring it up. All right. So we are hopefully feeling a little bit more comfortable with state now. So I want to call out two more, let's say, like advanced use cases that we're going to see for state. We saw some examples if you were in the session last week and going through adding to our blog, but a couple more examples that we'll also see in action at least a little bit today. So the first I'll point to is child-parent communication. So I think as we said talked about last week the idea of props as a way to communicate stuff from the parent to the child. But what if there's a situation where we want to communicate upwards from the child to the parent? And so a great way to do this is to set up some kind of state in the parent and then pass down the setter of that state to the child. And the child could then update, essentially have indirect access to updating that state. So here's an example here on the left. Let me get the annotate tool out again. So you can see here just a very rudimentary, simple example, which is honestly I would consider to be more pseudocode. But we have, in this case, at the top, some parent component, and we have a child component. Let me just draw a line here so it's pretty clear. So here in the parent component, let's say there's some kind of cart we have, and maybe we set this as a state in the parent component. We set up a function to be able to add to the cart here using the setter function from the state. But let's say in the child component, we have a button that we need to press to add something to the cart. The way we do this is we would say, okay, this a mutation function we have that mutates the state. Let's pass that as a prop here to the child component here, as you can see. And then in that child component, we now have access to this function, and then we can call it as we want. Let's say, like for example, in this on click on the button, and we can then indirectly essentially get access to update the cart in this case in some way up in the parent. So this also is a good example of generally it's a good idea to move state to kind of the highest in the tree that it needs to be accessed, right? So if you know that some piece of information is needed not just in one component by another component, you need to sort of track to what is the common parent somewhere up in the tree that has that, can have that information, and you can pass it down essentially through props downstream to the other child components. So this is again a pretty common sort of situation that you'll see, that you'll come across. Questions on that? Sort of like using this as a way to communicate upwards to components.
Yeah, I'm just kind of confused on the I guess like the workflow of this. If you can go over it again.
Yeah, let's do this one more time. So in this situation, right, the construction is essentially, let's assume this is a shopping of some kind, right? So we need some kind of cart, maybe that we're keeping track of what's in the user's cart. But so that we have that, but then we have a bunch of, let's say, product listings, and on each of those product listings, there's a button that allows you to add that item to the cart. So in this case, we need to somehow have a cart, but then we need to make sure that cart is accessible and adjust and can be edited essentially from any of the child components, essentially any of the product listing cards. And so to do that, this is where we redo the setup, right? Which is let's put the state at the very top, in the parent of the parent or whatever, right? I want to say the most senior component, but the component that's at the top of the tree that shares kind of the structure with most of the components that we care about. So in this case, it'd be like the parent component. That's where we set up the state. And then we can essentially allow all the children to have access to that state indirectly by passing something in as props into those children. So in this case, what we're saying is, let's essentially make sure every child has the ability to add an item to the cart. So we set up that function in the parent component, because it has access to the state still, to say, okay, add item to cart, we're going to then set cart to, and then we'll essentially add the item to the existing cart. And then we'll pass that function down to each of the children. So then in each child component, we can then call that function essentially as we need to. And we'll update the state in the parent component. So that's how we can maintain access to the state essentially all across the different components. And I think Brittany makes a good point as well. We will see this in action as well in another live coding example uh, to make it hopefully a little bit more concrete. But yeah, I think the main thing I would hammer home is this idea of you will oftentimes see this concept of passing the setters specifically of a state down to the children so that the children component can update the state in parent. That's a very common pattern that you'll see.
When you use the spread operator for that set cart
Mhm.
um, parameter, is it, I guess, just known that the second parameter is just added to the array, the item?
Yeah, and I think there's also a good question about this in the chat. So I think first to the question in the chat, is using a spread function a common thing? Yeah, I would say it's pretty common. Again, I would say like the spread operator, remember, is a feature of JavaScript, right? It's not a feature of like React, it's a feature of JavaScript. So it's really more than anything else, it's a convenience feature in JavaScript. So you have full access to it. So yeah, in this specific situation, it it just makes it easier to do this operation of just like appending something essentially to the end of a array. But yeah, in this case, I think showing to your question, the way this works, right, is you have set cart, and then you have to pass in essentially the new value, right, that we want. And so we can just say essentially just take the existing value of cart and then just like stick this new item at the end of that and then call it the new value and then send it through. Any other questions on at least at a high level of sort of this child-parent communication, reverse communication? And we'll see this also a live example of this as well, which should help make this a little bit more clear, hopefully. Cool. Let me clear this. And then yeah, and then there's the other scenario which I put here on the right. Um, there's this concept called controlled components. Wouldn't worry too much about it. I think next week we're gonna actually talk about it more, but just give it a preview, just to give you a motivating example, right, of where this comes handy. Let's say, for example, you have a login form, right, and you have like a username and password form. You probably want to, in some way, or maybe better example, an email and password that you have to enter in the form. Now, when you hit the submit button, or even before you hit the submit button, you might want to say, hey, I want to validate and see if whatever is being typed into the email field is actually like an email. It's a valid email. So how would I, while someone's typing in real time, track and see if it's actually a valid email or not? And maybe if it's not, highlight that box in red or something. So it turns out to do something like that, that's a great example of what's called controlled components, and state becomes very handy for those sorts of things. So just to give you a motivating example of something we'll see next week as yet another example of state and the power and how we can use it. All right. I think that's enough talking, and let's do some coding. Let me switch over. Okay. Hopefully you all can see my screen here. So, okay, so this week I put together this nice little to-do list for us to work through here. So just as a reminder, and for folks maybe who haven't joined us these sessions before, so we've been working through and creating a simple React blog together, utilizing the different sort of ideas that we've been going through in these last few weeks. So for those of you who've been here, you should hopefully this is quite familiar. Just between the different weeks, I just quickly did some styling cleanup because I was getting a little bit annoyed at how everything was looking. So just did some simple adjustments here. Nothing too crazy in CSS. But again, essentially here we have a list of a bunch of articles here with a title, author, date, and some content. And then we also last week set up this ability to switch the sources between two different arrays, essentially in this case. And we also add the ability to, if we click on one of these titles, we can hide and show the actual content. And all this essentially uses state to power all of this. So that's a quick recap of where we were. But let's add two things this week. The first is utilizing that same functionality of being able to open and close articles. Let's figure out how to track how many of the articles are actually open on the screen, and we can display that in some way. And then let's also add some search functionality, some very basic search functionality, be able to search based on matching to the titles of different articles. So let's first tackle how we might track how many articles are open. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hide all of these body contents by default, because in theory you could say like, hey, we want to track by default these are closed, and maybe we want to track how many of these are actually open by the user. So we're just going to go here. As a reminder, we have these article card components, which essentially is what each of these rows are. And we've set up this state variable here to determine whether the content here should be hidden or not. So right now it's false, they should not be hidden. Let's just change this default value to true. And now everything is hidden by default. We can still toggle that on and off, but by default, everything's hidden. So now we want to track how many of these are actually opened by the user. So let me throw it to you all. Any initial ideas of how we might go about trying to do this based on what we just talked about?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so what we're going to try and do here is essentially track how many of these articles are actually opened up, and then maybe we'll display that number somewhere here on the screen. So initial ideas for how we might go about structuring that feature.
I guess create an account variable to start.
Yep, that's a good start. And where do you think we should set that variable up in?
Um, I would say in the article list.
That is yep, that's one
Component. I
place we can
mean,
put it. Yep. Yep. Okay, let's put it there. I mean, I think that should actually work pretty well. So let's do that. So I'm going to create a state variable, as Sterling said. So I'll call it maybe articles open, uh, uh, set articles opened equals use state. And yeah, let's just be the number of articles. So we'll set that initially to 0. And just super quickly before I forget, I'm also just going to just output it somewhere. So I'm going to, instead of span, I'm just going to say number of articles opened, and I'm just going to render this out so we don't forget. So now we have number of articles opened is 0. All right, cool. What should we do next? We probably want this to now change as we open these up. So how should we go about doing that? Even if you're not sure, feel free
So
to
is it
go for it. Go for it, Brittany.
so I'm thinking about one example for this week, like a counter, like where you use like to set articles open and you pass in articles open and like based on the clicks you count how many have been open.
Yep, that's definitely on the right track. I like where we're going with that. So we definitely need to use this set articles open. Um, so how specifically do you think we should start setting that up?
Maybe put a handler function. in like ability to return, and you pass in the set articles open, and then like in the parentheses you increment articles open.
Yep. So I like where you're heading with that. So I think what I'm hearing is first, let's maybe pass the set articles open down into the article cards so that they can actually update this value in some way. So let's just pass it in. I'm going to be lazy here and just use the same name, but you can name this whatever you want. And we just need to make sure we have access to that prop now in the article card component. And then I think Brittany, I think what I heard as well from you is then we need to then use this to increment in some way the article is open. So because we already have some functionality when we click on in this case, the H1, let's just start extracting this into a separate function just to make it clean. So I'll say const handle click. And for now, I'm going to copy this existing functionality we had here to toggle this, and I will just pass this handle click. So if I haven't changed functionality, just move this function out into a separate function. So this stays the same. And you were right, Brittany, we want to somehow update the articles open. And we can use the same helper syntax as we had before, where we can actually have access to the previous value of the state. So we call it previous, and I think what you were saying is just we can just increment it by 1. Okay, well, let's try. Let's see if it works. So I'm going to click this. Okay, that's good. That's a 1. If I click it again, though, it goes to 2. So let's just observe here. Okay, so it is incrementing, which is good. But I think there's a couple issues here, maybe. What do folks see as maybe potential issues? I see 2 potential issues with this as it's currently built.
A solid increment like 2 at a time. Like
Yep,
yeah, that, and then like it has to be where it's only when you open the article, not closing.
yep, exactly. So how should we? So I think let's go with the second one you mentioned, which is it's also essentially incrementing when it closes. How do you think we can go about fixing that?
Maybe what if we add use state false and just in this case previous -1?
So so I see where you're going with that. So I think we still, I think so okay, this is actually a good clarification point. There are I think this is a good discussion. There's a couple ways we can define the number of articles that are open. So one way we can define is how many are open at any given time, right? So like right now there's 0 articles open. If I open these 2, there's 2 articles open. If I close this one, there's only 1 article open. So that's one way we can do it. The second definition, which I think might actually be, let's say, more useful in a kind of real context, is the user opened. Did they open one of these? Did they open 2? Did they open all the articles at some point? So almost tracking like the clicks almost, right? It's almost like if you have social media, like has someone clicked on this post essentially at some point. So let's maybe let's assume that definition of has this article been clicked at some point in the past. So with that in mind, maybe let's first tackle again this question of like when I close an article, essentially it's still incrementing by 1. So how might we first directly go tackle that?
I think we use use effect.
We probably could, but I don't think we need to in this case. I think we can actually keep it pretty simple. But that is a good call.
Okay.
Should we check if set visible body is true on that component?
Yep, I think that's a good way to do this. So what Sterling is saying, right, is before we even set the articles open and do this increment, let's just see if like whether the body is currently hidden or not. So in this case, let's just be really precise about it. When the body is hidden, we do want to increment this because that means it's if it's hidden, that means it's in this state. And if we click it, that means it should open up and we want to increment this. But if the body is not hidden, then we don't want to do the increment essentially. So let's just check that. So we will say if the body is hidden, so that means it's in this like closed state, then let's go ahead and move this increment function in there. Otherwise, if it's not hidden, then we'll just bypass all of this altogether and just do the toggling down here. Okay, let's try it. So I'm going to refresh so we get back to 0. Click it. Okay, increments. That's good. If I close it, nice. It does not increment. Seems to work for all these articles. Now, if I click open one of these articles again, though, it is essentially double counting every time I click open this article, which again, I think maybe in this specific feature example, we probably don't want that to happen. We only want it to increment once for a specific article, and that's it, never again. So thoughts on how we might do that? And that I would say to do this, it actually might require some more extensive changes in how we've set this up a little bit, actually, even from the beginning up here. So any thoughts on that? How we might go about doing that?
I have ideas, but I don't think they're good. And I don't know
It
how I
does.
would code it either.
It doesn't matter. We want any ideas are good ideas here. So go for it, Barbara.
What if we had like a specific ID for each of the articles, so that way you can have like your array of the different IDs, and then you know for sure when each one of them is being clicked only.
Okay, I love that. That is 100% on the right track. So as I said, no idea is a bad idea. So okay, so that's a very good call. So let's double check here if we had an ID set on this data. And of course, we weren't following best practices, and there is not an ID on each of these. So let's just quickly set an ID on each of these because that is best practice. I'm gonna quickly do that. Simple numbers for now. 4 and 5. Okay, so now we have okay, I'll add it to this one too. Okay, so now we have an ID on each piece of data.
ID5 is 1. You didn't change the ID5.
I think I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
No, but thanks for double checking. Yeah, I changed this to 1 here because it's a separate list. But thanks for double checking that.
Okay, for your previous question, I think we add the property that the article already open or not, like is opened. So we set the default is false. If the article open, we set true. So it means it's already open, and we don't we check the variable.
Yeah, so I think that's a great idea. So let's go down that path actually. So I think the suggestion was let's set a new state variable on each article card, and then let's actually have each card track essentially whether it's been open or not in the past, and then we can use that to essentially determine whether we should keep incrementing. So let's do that. So let's say set up a new state. Say has been opened. That has been opened. Use state. Going to start as false, nothing has been opened. And then we're going to say, maybe down here, it's like if if body hidden is true, we definitely want to, then we need to essentially double check again if it has not been opened in the past, then let's actually do the increment. Otherwise, we just skip all this. And just to be a little bit more succinct, we can combine these two if statements and say if its body is hidden and this is also true, just to make this a little bit more cleaner. Then we go ahead and do that. And then the important thing we just need to do as well here is if we're going to increment, we need to also make sure we tell this element, hey, you've been open now. So let's say, yes, you have been open now. So set that to true. So then this won't keep running again and again. Okay, let's try it. I like this idea. So let's open one. Okay, still increment by one. That's good. If I close it, okay, that's still working. If I open another one, it's still working. Let's open the first one. Look at that. It's working. It's not incrementing again. Exactly as we want. The rest of these still increment, but no repeats this time. Nice. So this is so the beautiful thing is this, there's always more than one way to do things. So I think this is a great way to do it here, which is essentially store this information inside of each article card. I do want to get back to Barbara's suggestion as well, which was, is there a way we can track essentially, maybe somewhere else, which articles have been opened based on their IDs, and essentially use that to figure out how many unique IDs essentially have been opened. So given just time, I'm going to structure this out a little bit and then ask questions for sure, because this is a little bit more of a, let's say, advanced setup that you might see. So the way I would go about doing this, for example, is I would actually, in the article list, instead of the state being the number of articles that are open, the state I would set to be this, making an array of IDs that have been opened at some point. So for example, I would say, maybe I'll just rename this here to number of articles open, set number of articles open, and just update these names here. Okay. So let me set a new state here. I'll go call it, these are the actual articles that are open. Set articles open. And again, I want this to be an array essentially. So by default, I'm going to have it be an empty array. So this should be the array of articles that have been opened at some point. And here, instead of now displaying just the number of articles open, this original state, I will render out instead the length of essentially this array. So articles opened dot length. So initially, nothing's been open. This array is empty. It's still going to show 0. If I refresh the page, still going to be 0. So then how I would then I would actually update this then is I would, again, similar structure in terms of I would still pass in the setter. So in this case, I would say, let me just switch. Let me do a couple of setters here just to be pretty clear. So I'm going to keep the old functionality still, and we'll comment it out. But I'll pass this other setter in for the array. And then I can do some logic then to update this array up here. And just to make it a little bit cleaner, I'm actually just going to make the logic up in the parent component just because it makes conceptual sense. I could put this logic down in each article card as well. I'm going to say, I'll make a function, I'll call it add article to list. And I'll take an article object. And essentially I would check if the article has already been added to the array, I'm just going to skip it. If it hasn't been added, then I'll add it to this array. So the way I would quickly do this is just say articles opened. I can filter this array, and I can filter it based on matching if the value in any given array, if its ID is equal to the ID of the article I'm passing. So this will tell me whether an article with the same ID is in this list. And this would feed back an array. And I can just check essentially if the length of this array is greater than 0, then I can just set articles open and just add the new item. And we can use the spread operator here again. Articles open, and I can add the article that's being passed up here. Then I can pass this down, say add article to list is this function. I'm going to get rid of this one. So now I've given each article card the ability to add its article to this array. And then here I can just make sure I access it in the props. And then the handle click now, instead of doing most of this logic, I can update the logic. So I'm just going to copy this and just comment this out. And now all I have to check for is if the body is hidden. I still need to check for that. Then I will say add article to list and pass in the article data that we have passed through. Okay, that was a lot of moving parts, so I'm going to go through that all again. But first, let's make sure this works. Make sure I didn't make a mistake. If I click on this one, okay, well, we already see a mistake. It's not opening. So let's see, add article to list. If article.filter is greater than 0. Okay, well, I already see the issue. I did the wrong thing. Okay, so let's try this, and then I'll explain this one more time. If I click on this, it adds it. If I close it, it doesn't add it. If I open it again, it does not add it. So we get that same functionality. If I add a different article, still will add it, but it won't repeat that. So same end result, but I just want to give you a flavor for a different way to approach it. So let me just repeat this one more time because there's a lot of things that we just changed. So what we've done here is we've said instead of tracking a number of articles open, we're going to track which actual articles have been opened. And we're going to track that essentially in a list, in this case, an array. So originally, this array is going to be empty. And then as we click on each article, we're going to potentially update this array. Now, we need to be careful of not double counting or double adding an article into the array. And that's why we've done some logic here to say, let's first see if there's any articles that have that matching ID. And if there isn't anything, if the length of that matching is 0, then we will add this article to the array and append it to the array. Otherwise, we just won't do anything. So we've set that check up. And then we've said we want this ability to add the article to the list to happen in each article card. So we pass this function down using that child-parent communication technique that we talked about as a prop that now is accessible in the child. And so now in the onClick, still checking if the body is hidden, of course, because we don't want to count something if you're closing the article. We can just then call this function add article to list and pass in the article for that specific card. So again, this is a great example of sort of passing this just a different way essentially to get the same output functionality. And each is one better than the other. It depends on the situation and a lot of different factors, but just want to show you like another way we can go about getting that same functionality.
Can I see the card component again?
Yes.
Okay, so you got rid of the and has been opened in the if statement, and you just replaced set article, you replaced the setters with the add article to list function.
Yep, that's right. And then that, remember, indirectly, if we go up to that function, is just calling essentially the setter for this new state that we set up. But obviously with this kind of additional check built in. But that's exactly right in terms of the changes we made. We essentially, effectively what we've done is we've moved the tracking of whether something has been opened from each card. And we just moved that tracking up a level into the parent, in this case, as this list instead.
Okay, so I guess then you don't need the has been open use state in the child anymore.
Yep, ideally, like in this situation, you could get rid of this, and then you could also, we kind of switched the way we're tracking, so you could also get rid of this state up here as well. again, to be super clear, both these methods are totally valid and they work, as we saw. Just good to see different ways of doing things. One of these might be better in one situation versus maybe the other one in a different situation. So just trying to get you all seeing different ways of doing these things. So you at least have seen them at least once. Yes, no, that's correct, Brittany. So you're right. So we're taking a couple of weeks here to talk about state, because it is so important. So we are talking about states again for week 4. I think we're going to continue talking about state as well in week 5. So you'll see it again.
So wait, today is this conditional rendering we talked about, or we're still talking about hooks and states?
So today's would be more the hooks and the states. And so specifically, I think, the key thing in state, right, that we sort of explored here is this idea of how do we communicate upwards, right, from the child to the parent and like access the state that sits in the parent by passing down the setters as props. So I would say that's like the key thing with state. And then we've also just like introduced the concept of hooks, right, as we talked about earlier. I know we're pretty much at time, so we're not going to get to building the search functionality this week. But next week when we do search functionality, like we're going to start to see use refs and other interesting applications show up. So we'll see that more live next week. The conditional rendering we talked a little bit about it last week. I'm not sure if you were in the session last week, Brittany, or not, but that is actually more of a week 5 thing. Kind of jumped the gun a little bit on that. But we will spend more time on that, I think, in the next week or so.
I asked because on the thing it says that that stuff is week 4, so that's why I was like I was confused.
Oh, got it. Yeah,
Yeah, so something's not right on the site. So
yeah, there might be a typo in there. Yeah, I think conditional rendering is more we're going to see it, I think, next week in week 5. So this week is really focused on just like introducing the concept of hooks, like we talked about, use state, use ref, use effect, and then these some more advanced use cases for state, like passing information upwards from a child to a parent.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.